The smell of bacon reaches the porch before the sun does. It drifts through the screen door of a farmhouse kitchen in Central Texas, July 1945, and finds two people who should not be sitting there. A Japanese woman with posture straight as a fence post. A 5-year-old girl with eyes too large for her face holding a one-armed cloth doll in her lap. Thomas Hargrove stands at the stove. He is 44 years old. His hands are rough and scarred from a lifetime of pulling things from Texas soil. He flips bacon in a cast-iron skillet seasoned by 3 generations of Hargrove hands. The grease sings. The eggs crack into shimmering fat. The biscuits come out golden from the oven. He carries 2 plates to the table, sets one before the woman, one before the child. The plates are full, not measured, not rationed, full in the way that only a Texas kitchen can be full, where food is not calculation, but declaration. The woman looks at her plate and does not move. The girl looks at her mother, waits. The woman nods. The child picks up a strip of bacon with both hands, raises it to her mouth, chews, and begins to cry. Not from pain, not from fear. She cries because her body remembers something her mind has forgotten. The taste of enough. 3 years of camp rations have taught this child that food comes in small portions and without love. And now this salt, this smoke, this impossible abundance from the hands of a man who should be her enemy. Tom Hargrove watches a Japanese child cry over his bacon. His son Billy died 3 months ago on a hillside in Okinawa. Japanese bullets, Japanese soil. Every morning since Tom has cooked breakfast for Billy's empty chair. This morning, for the first time, he has set the plate before someone else. He has placed the food in front of a woman whose face belongs to the nation that killed his boy. And as the child weeps over bacon, Tom feels something shift inside his chest. Not forgiveness, not compassion, something smaller and more dangerous. A crack. The question that will follow Tom Hargrove for the rest of his life is not why he did it. The question is why it felt like the first right thing he has done in months. But that question belongs to a later part of this story. To understand how a grieving Texas rancher ended up cooking breakfast for the enemy, you need to go back. Back before the bacon and the tears and the discovery that the woman sitting at his table is hiding a photograph inside her shoe. A photograph of a man in an American military uniform. A man who died saving Texas soldiers in a French forest. A man whose last words connect him to Billy Hargrove in ways that will shatter every wall Tom has spent 3 months building. Before all of that, Tom Hargrove did not cook for anyone living. He cooked for a ghost. Every morning for 3 months, Tom Hargrove has cooked breakfast for a boy who will never eat again. Billy Hargrove, 21 years old, Private First Class United States Army, killed in action on the 22nd of May, 1945, on a hillside in Okinawa that has no name anyone in Texas would recognize. The notification came in June. A telegram first, then a letter. Then silence that filled every room of the farmhouse like floodwater, rising an inch each day until Tom felt he was drowning in his own kitchen. He does not eat. He sits across from the empty chair and drinks his coffee and watches the eggs grow cold and the bacon congeal in its grease and the biscuits harden at the edges. This is his ritual, his penance, his conversation with the dead. Sometimes he speaks. Hot today, son. Fence on the south side needs fixing. Your mother misses you something terrible. The words float across the table and dissolve into the empty chair like smoke. Martha hears him from the bedroom. She has heard him every morning for 3 months. She lies in bed with her eyes open and listens to her husband talk to their dead son, and she does not intervene because she understands that this is the only thing keeping him from the alternative. The alternative being the rifle in the barn and the whiskey that has become his nightly companion, and the darkness that she can see growing behind his eyes like a storm building on the horizon. The war took more than his son. It took his reason for waking up. It took the future he had mapped out in his mind, the future where Billy would inherit the 400 acres and marry some local girl and fill this kitchen with grandchildren who would learn to ride horses before they learned to read, just like every Hargrove before them. The war took that future and replaced it with a telegram and a folded flag and an empty chair. Tom enlisted in the last war, 1918. He was 17, lied about his age, made it to France in time to hear the guns stop. He came home with no wounds and no stories worth telling and married Martha Dawson, the preacher's daughter, because she laughed at his jokes and could shoot a rifle better than most men in the county. They built a life on this land: cattle, horses, a vegetable garden, a son born in 1924 who grew up brown and wiry and fearless, who rode his first horse at 4 and shot his first deer at 12 and kissed his first girl at 50. The detail: Billy confessed to his father one evening on the porch while the sun went down and the coyotes started their nightly conversation in the hills. When Pearl Harbor hit, Billy was 17. He wanted to enlist immediately. Tom said no, not because Tom was afraid, because Tom knew what war was. He had seen France, he had smelled it, and he did not want his son to carry that smell in his memory for the rest of his life. But Billy waited exactly 1 year, turned 18, walked into the recruiting office in San Antonio and signed his name with the same steady hand that could rope a calf at full gallop. Tom drove him to the bus station. Martha packed sandwiches, brisket on white bread with pickles, Billy's favorite. They stood on the platform, and Tom wanted to say something profound, something that would protect his son like armor. But all that came out was "right to your mother" and a handshake that lasted 4 seconds longer than any handshake should. Billy wrote letters from Camp Hood, letters from Hawaii, letters from places he could not name because the censors would black them out. The letters were cheerful, funny, full of complaints about the food and jokes about the sergeants and questions about Dusty, the old hound dog who slept on the porch and howled at the moon every Tuesday for reasons no one had ever determined. The last letter arrived in June 1945. It arrived on the same day as the death notification. Martha opened the notification. Tom opened the letter. He read the first line and stopped. "Dad, I have to tell you about the Japanese soldiers who saved my life." Tom stopped reading. He folded the letter. He walked to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer. He placed the letter inside. He locked the drawer. He took the key and dropped it into an old ammunition box on the shelf above his desk. And he never went back. He could not read past that first line. The Japanese killed Billy. The Japanese took his son. And Billy's last words on earth were about Japanese soldiers saving his life. The contradiction was a knife in Tom's chest, and he dealt with it the way Hargrove men have always dealt with pain. He locked it away and poured whiskey over it and pretended it did not exist. 3 months passed. The ranch declined. Fences fell. Cattle grew thin. The vegetable garden choked with weeds. Juan and Carlos, the two ranch hands who had worked for Tom for years, left for better-paying jobs at the munitions factory in San Antonio. Martha tried to hold things together, but 400 acres of Texas brush country does not yield to one woman's determination, no matter how fierce that woman is. Tom drank. Not during the day. He maintained that boundary. But every evening after supper, he would walk to the barn, sit on an overturned feed bucket, open a bottle of Old Crow, and drink until the stars blurred and Billy's face stopped appearing every time he closed his eyes. Dusty would lie at his feet, too old and too loyal to leave his graying muzzle resting on Tom's boot, his brown eyes watching his master with the patient concern that only very old dogs possess. Martha watched. Martha waited. Martha read the letter in the locked drawer because she knew where the key was, and she was not a woman who believed in locked doors between a mother and her dead son's last words. She read every word Billy wrote, and what she read changed everything she understood about the war. But she did not tell Tom. Not yet. He was not ready. The armor he had built around his grief was the only thing holding him upright, and she was not going to demolish it until she was certain there was something strong enough on the other side to catch him. Then Jennings came. The military jeep pulled up to the front gate on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July. The dust it raised hung in the still air like a brown curtain. 2 men stepped out. The first was a civilian from the Immigration and Naturalization Service, a bureaucrat in a wilted suit who looked like he had been melting slowly since he crossed the Texas border. The second was a soldier. Sergeant Roy Jennings was not a large man, but he occupied space with the kind of precision that made you notice him. His uniform was pressed. His boots were polished to a shine that seemed to defy the laws of Texas dust. His hair was regulation short. His jaw was clean-shaven. He smiled frequently, but the smile had a mechanical quality, like a door opening and closing on schedule. His eyes did not participate in the smile. His eyes were doing something else entirely. They were measuring, calculating, filing away details for later use. Tom met them on the porch. He did not invite them inside. Martha watched from the kitchen window. The civilian explained. Crystal City internment camp 60 miles to the southwest was overcrowded. The government was encouraging local ranchers to take on internees as supervised labor. The internees would remain under Crystal City's jurisdiction, returning to camp each evening, but could work on local properties during the day. In exchange, ranchers would pay a modest fee to the government and provide a midday meal. Tom's answer was immediate. I don't want Japanese on my land. His voice was flat, not loud. The kind of quiet that is more frightening than shouting, because it suggests a decision that was made long ago and will not be revisited. Martha saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. The civilian tried again, gesturing at the sagging fences, the thin cattle, the general air of decline that hung over the property like a second layer of heat. Tom cut him off. My ranch is none of your business. The civilian retreated to the jeep, but Jennings stayed. He asked Tom if they could speak privately. The two men walked toward the barn, away from the civilian, away from Martha's window. Jennings spoke quietly, intimately, like a man sharing a confidence rather than making a pitch. Mr. Hargrove, I understand. I lost someone to the Japanese too. My brother, Danny. Baton. He paused, letting the word land. Baton. Every American knew what Baton meant. The death march. 75,000 prisoners forced to walk 65 miles in the Philippine heat. Thousands died of exhaustion disease and Japanese brutality. Danny Jennings was one of them. I'm not asking you to like them, Jennings continued. I'm only saying that if you take them on, you'd be helping me. I'm conducting security assessments on certain internees, evaluating whether they should be repatriated to Japan. If one of them works on your property, I can observe their behavior in an open environment. You help me, and I'll make sure you get priority when the Veterans Agricultural Support Program opens up. Tom studied the man. Jennings met his gaze steadily, and for a moment Tom saw something genuine behind the mechanical smile. Grief. Real grief worn smooth by years of practice, but they're still sharp underneath. Tom recognized it because he saw the same thing in his own mirror every morning. Who am? Tom asked. A woman and her young daughter. Sachiko Tanaka, Japanese national. Husband deceased. The girl is 5, American-born. A woman and a child. Tom repeated it as if testing the weight of the words. They're not dangerous, Mr. Hargrove, but the paperwork needs to be done correctly. I need to assess them before I make my recommendation. Tom looked at his ranch. The south fence had been down for 2 weeks. 3 calves had wandered through the paint last Thursday, and it took him half a day to round them up alone. The windmill pump needed repair. The hay needed cutting before the fall rains. Martha was working herself thin, trying to compensate for 2 missing ranch hands and a husband who spent his evenings in the barn with a bottle. He thought about what Billy would say. Then he thought about how Billy would never say anything again. And in that space between what his son would have wanted and what his woman could no longer want, Tom made a decision that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with math. The ranch needed hands. Any hands. Fine, he said, but they work. No charity, no special treatment. Of course, Jennings said, and smiled his mechanical smile. Martha heard the news and said nothing for a long moment. Then, are you sure with everything you're going through, with the drinking, with... Tom cut her off. I'm fine. They both knew it was a lie, but it was a lie they had agreed to live inside the way people in a leaking house agree not to mention the rain. That night, Tom sat in the barn with his whiskey and his photograph of Billy at 10 years old on horseback, grinning at the camera with 2 missing front teeth and a lasso coiled over his shoulder like he was already a man. Tom touched the photograph with one weathered finger. I'm letting them come, son. Japanese. On our land. Don't think it means anything. Just need the help. Dusty whined softly. Tom drank. If you believe that stories like this, stories about the choices ordinary people make when hatred and mercy collide, are stories worth remembering, then subscribe to this channel. We tell one new story every week. Stories that the history books forgot. Stories that explain not just what happened, but what it felt like to live through it. And somewhere 60 miles southwest in a cinder block building behind barbed wire, Sachiko Tanaka lay on a narrow cot with her daughter Yumi, curled against her side, both of them sleeping. The shallow, vigilant sleep of people who have learned that safety is always temporary. 3 days later, the military transport truck stopped at the gate of the Hargrove Ranch at 6:15 in the morning. The engine idled. The canvas flap at the back opened, and Sachiko Tanaka stepped onto Texas soil. Tom watched from the porch. The first thing he noticed was her posture. Straight. Not stiff, not military, but upright in a way that spoke of discipline, of a body that had been trained to present composure even when composure was the furthest thing from what she felt. She wore a plain cotton work shirt and trousers issued by the camp. Her hair was pulled back with a strip of cloth. Her face revealed nothing. But her eyes. Tom noticed her eyes. They moved across the property in a quick, systematic sweep. Barn, windmill, house, fences, exits. She was not looking at a ranch. She was assessing a situation. Reading the terrain the way a soldier reads a battlefield, looking for cover, for escape routes, for threats. Tom recognized the behavior because he had done the same thing in France 27 years ago, the first time he stepped into a landscape that might want to kill him. Behind her, a small figure emerged from the truck. Yumi Tanaka, 5 years old, dark hair cut short in a practical bob, enormous eyes that seemed too large for her face, as if nature had given her extra capacity for seeing in a world that did not want to be seen clearly. She held her mother's hand with one fist and clutched a small cloth doll with the other. The doll was missing one arm. No one had replaced it. The girl's eyes found Dusty immediately. The old dog lay on the porch in his usual spot, observing the arrivals with the measured interest of an animal who has seen many things come and go from this property and expects to see many more. Yumi tugged her mother's hand and pointed. She said something in Japanese. Sachiko shook her head slightly and tightened her grip on the child's fingers. Private Ortiz, the escort, jumped down from the cab. He was 19 from El Paso with the easy manner of someone who had not yet learned that the world was a complicated place. He would spend most of his days at the Hargrove Ranch reading comic books under the shade tree by the barn and occasionally falling asleep with his cap over his face. He was not a guard in any meaningful sense. He was a checkbox on a form that allowed the system to say supervision had been provided. Tom looked at the woman and child standing in his yard. He saw Japanese faces. He saw Okinawa. He saw the hillside where Billy fell. His stomach knotted and his jaw tightened, and for one moment the hatred was so pure and so clean that it felt almost like relief, like the simplicity of knowing exactly who your enemy is and why you despise them. Then Martha stepped onto the porch. Practical as a fence post. "I'm Martha. This is Tom. Come inside. It's already too hot out here." Her voice carried no warmth and no hostility, just the plain declarative tone of a Texas woman who dealt in facts and left emotions to people who had time for them. The kitchen, the wooden table with 4 chairs, and here Tom's breath caught just slightly, just enough for Martha to notice. Because the 4th chair, the chair where Billy sat still, had a plate and a cup set before it. Martha's daily ritual, Tom's daily torment. She moved quickly to clear the place setting, but the damage was done. Tom had seen it. The ghost of breakfast for a dead boy about to be replaced by a living girl. Martha cooked. The sounds filled the kitchen like a language older than English or Japanese. Bacon in the cast iron skillet, that same sizzle and pop, the same smell that had greeted every Hargrove morning for 3 generations. Eggs cracked into the shimmering grease, their yolks deep orange from the farm's own hens. Biscuits pulled from the oven, their tops golden, their insides soft as cloud. Real butter, strawberry preserves, coffee black and unyielding. Martha set a full plate before Sachiko, then a smaller plate before Yumi. The plates were full. Not carefully rationed, not measured, not calculated. Full. Heaped. Abundant in the way that only a Texas kitchen can be abundant, where food is not sustenance but statement, where feeding someone is the most fundamental act of human recognition. Sachiko looked at the plate. 3 months in Crystal City. The food there was adequate. The camp was considered one of the most humane in the system. But camp food is camp food. Institutional, measured, stripped of love. Before that, California. Before that, Kobe. And before all of it, before the camps and the war and the telegram that told her Kenji was never coming home. There had been mornings when her husband cooked American breakfast in their small Sacramento apartment, bacon and eggs and toast, because Kenji was Nisei, born in America, raised on both Japanese and American food, and he loved bacon the way some men love poetry, with a devotion that transcended reason. The smell of bacon now was not just a smell, it was memory. It was Kenji whistling in the kitchen on a Sunday morning in 1940. It was the life she had been promised, and the life that was taken, and the impossibility of sitting in a stranger's kitchen in Texas eating the same food her dead husband used to cook with the same joy. Sachiko controlled herself. She ate slowly, small bites, measured. She would not lose composure in front of these people. Loss of control before the enemy was loss of everything. But the bacon, the salt, the smoke, the richness of the fat dissolving on her tongue. Her body recognized what her mind refused to accept. This was not enemy food. This was the taste of the country Kenji had loved enough to die for. Yumi had no such restraint. Yumi had no politics, no history, no framework of hatred or caution. Yumi had a 5-year-old's body that had spent 3 years eating camp rations, and a 5-year-old's brain that had almost forgotten what real food tasted like. The child reached for the bacon with both hands, then stopped, looked at her mother, waited. Sachiko nodded, the smallest nod, nearly invisible. Yumi picked up the bacon, raised it to her mouth, bit down, chewed. And the tears came, the same tears Tom had already glimpsed in that future morning, 10 days from now, the tears of a child whose body remembers what her mind has lost. The feeling of being full, the feeling of flavor. The feeling of enough. Tom stood at the counter with his coffee and watched. He did not sit at the table. He was not ready for that, but he watched, and the crack that had opened inside him, when he first saw this child cry, the crack he would not fully understand until 10 days later, when he stood at this same stove and cooked for them. By choice instead of obligation, that crack began here, in this moment. In the sound of a 5-year-old girl weeping over bacon because the world had taught her that abundance was impossible, and this kitchen had just proved the world wrong. He turned away, poured more coffee. His hand trembled. Martha saw it. She said nothing. Sachiko wiped Yumi's face with a napkin. "Eat slowly," she said in Japanese. Then to Martha in English, that was better than anyone in the room expected. "Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove. She has not had food like this in a long time." Martha nodded. "There's more if she wants it." There was more. There was always more. This was Texas, where the response to any crisis, any grief, any confusion, any silence too heavy to bear, was to put food on the table and trust that nourishment would do what words could not. After breakfast, Tom gave Sachiko her first assignment. He spoke to Martha, not to Sachiko. "South fence needs fixing. Show her where the tools are." He could not bring himself to address her directly. Not yet. Direct address would mean acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean she was a person. And if she was a person, then the crack would widen, and Tom was not ready for what lay on the other side. But Sachiko heard, and Sachiko understood more than the words. She understood the averted eyes, the rigid posture, the way this man held his coffee cup with both hands, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was tilting beneath his feet. She understood because she recognized the posture of grief. She wore it herself every day, though she wore it differently, inward instead of outward, silent instead of stiff. She followed Martha to the barn. She picked up the tools. She walked to the south fence, and she began to work. Efficiently, precisely, without complaint, because work was the only language she and Tom Hargrove currently shared, and she intended to speak it fluently. Yumi stayed near the house. Within minutes, she had crossed the porch to where Dusty lay. The old dog lifted his head. The child sat down beside him. She placed one small hand on his graying muzzle. Dusty's tail moved once, twice, a slow metronome of acceptance. Yumi began talking to the dog in Japanese, a stream of earnest, incomprehensible monologue that Dusty received with the dignified attention of an animal who has always known that language is less important than presence. Tom watched from the window, a Japanese child talking to his dog on his porch. 3 months ago, he would have seen an enemy. Today, against every instinct, against everything he believed he saw, a 5-year-old girl who loved dogs. Just that. Nothing more. He turned away from the window, poured more coffee, and did not look again. But that evening, after the military truck carried Sachiko and Yumi back to Crystal City, after Martha cleared the dishes and swept the kitchen and went to bed, Tom sat in his barn with his bottle and his photograph and his old dog, And he found that for the first time in 3 months, the whiskey did not taste like comfort. It tasted like what it was: poison. A slower poison than a bullet, but poison all the same. He looked at Billy's photograph. "They sat in your chair today, son. The woman and the little girl. She cried over the bacon." He paused, took a drink that burned less than it should have. "What am I doing, Billy?" The photograph did not answer. Dusty sighed in his sleep. And in the locked drawer of Tom's desk 20 feet away, Billy's last letter waited in the darkness, with the patience of all things that contain the truth but cannot force anyone to read them. The days found their rhythm the way all things in Texas find their rhythm, slowly, reluctantly, under the pressure of heat and necessity. By the end of the first week, the Hargrove Ranch had developed a routine that none of its occupants had agreed to, but all of them obeyed. The military truck arrived at 6:15. Sachiko and Yumi stepped out. Private Ortiz settled under the shade tree with his comic books, and the work began. Tom gave instructions through Martha for the first 2 days. South fence. Water the cattle. Hay in the west barn needs stacking. He spoke to his wife, and his wife relayed the words to Sachiko as if there were a vast ocean between the rancher and the Japanese woman, rather than the 12 feet of kitchen floor that actually separated them. Sachiko received each instruction with a nod that was neither submissive nor defiant. It was professional, the nod of someone who understood that work was the currency of her survival and intended to pay in full. She was stronger than Tom expected. Not in the way of size or brute force, but in the quiet strength of someone who has learned to be efficient with every movement, because waste is a luxury she has never been able to afford. She fixed fence posts with a precision that surprised him. Her hands moved quickly, with the wire twisting and securing with the economy of long practice. When she stacked hay, she calculated the angles to minimize effort and maximize stability. When she fed the cattle, she observed their behavior, first noted which ones were dominant, which were skittish, which would come to the trough calmly, and which needed space, and she adjusted her approach for each one without being told. Tom noticed. He told himself he was not noticing, but he was. The way a rancher notices weather or the condition of a fence line. Not admiration, assessment. On the third day, Yumi breached the wall. She had spent the first 2 days orbiting Dusty like a small moon, feeding him scraps she smuggled from the kitchen table, talking to him in a mixture of Japanese and the broken English she was beginning to assemble from the words she heard Martha and Ortiz use. But on the third day, the orbit expanded. Yumi followed Tom onto the porch, where he sat eating his midday sandwich alone. She sat down next to him without invitation. Dusty followed, settling between them with the diplomatic neutrality of an animal who has no interest in human boundaries. Yumi looked at Tom's sandwich, looked at Dusty, began explaining something to the wine in Japanese, gesturing with her small hands, her voice earnest and musical, and completely incomprehensible to every English speaker within earshot. Tom ate his sandwich and said nothing, but he did not tell her to leave. On the fourth day, Tom spoke directly to Sachiko for the first time. They were in the west pasture, moving a group of cattle to fresh grass. The operation required coordination. Tom pointed at the fence gate. "Open it when I signal. Close it after the last one's through." Short sentences, functional, no warmth, but direct. He was speaking to her. Sachiko responded in an English that carried the ghost of a Japanese accent, but was clear, grammatically correct, and far more fluent than Tom had assumed. "Yes, Mr. Hargrove." He looked at her for one beat longer than necessary. He had assumed she barely spoke English. He had assumed wrong, and the realization that he had made an assumption based on her face rather than evidence was a small, uncomfortable stone in his boot that he could not quite shake loose. On the fifth day, the calf happened. A young heifer had tangled herself in a section of barbed wire near the creek bed. She was bleeding from 3 gashes across her flank and bawling with the high panicked cry of an animal that does not understand pain but knows it wants the pain to stop. Tom reached her first. He grabbed the calf's body, trying to hold her still, while he worked the wire loose, but the animal thrashed, and the barbs bit into his forearms, and the blood his and the calf's made everything slippery and difficult. Sachiko was beside him in seconds. She did not ask what to do. She assessed the situation the way she assessed everything, quickly, systematically, completely, And then she acted. She positioned herself at the calf's head, gripping firmly but not roughly, using her body weight to stabilize the animal while Tom worked the wire free. The calf kicked. Sachiko held, her feet planted in the mud, her arms locked, her face showing the trained calm of someone who has dealt with emergencies before and knows that panic is the enemy of competence. Tom freed the last strand of wire. The calf stumbled upright, still bawling, blood running down her flank in bright red ribbons. Sachiko was already moving. She pulled a strip of cloth from her own sleeve, tearing it with her teeth in one clean motion. She rinsed the wound with water from the creek, pressing the cloth firmly against the deepest gash to stop the bleeding. Her hands moved with a precision that was not learned from ranching. This was training, medical training, the quick, confident movements of someone who had been taught to treat wounds and had done it enough times for the knowledge to live in her muscles rather than her mind. Tom watched her hands work. Nurses' hands, healers' hands, hands that had been trained to save lives in a country that was now in ruins, working on a Texas calf in a Texas creek bed because history had decided that this woman's skills would be tested not in a hospital, but in a pasture. He almost said something. The word thanks rose in his throat and stopped at his teeth. He swallowed it, not yet, but the stone in his boot had grown larger, and ignoring it was becoming its own kind of work. That evening, Tom sat on the porch instead of retreating to the barn. Martha noticed but said nothing. She brought him coffee instead of watching him reach for the bottle. He drank it slowly, watching the sun drop behind the mesquite trees, painting the sky in shades of copper and bruise. Dusty lay at his feet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote began its evening complaint against the universe. "She fixed that calf better than Doc Carter would have," Tom said, not looking at Martha. Martha sat in the rocker beside him. She was a nurse in Japan before she married. Tom absorbed this. A nurse, a healer, a woman who had been trained to put broken things back together. He looked at his own hands, rough and scarred hands that had spent a lifetime building fences and roping cattle and holding whiskey bottles, and once holding his son's small fingers on the grip of a rifle to teach him how to shoot. His hands had been made to build and to break. Her hands had been made to heal. "Her husband," Tom said, "the one who died. She said he died in Europe. Japanese don't fight in Europe." Martha was quiet for a long moment. The rocker creaked on the wooden porch. "No," she said carefully. "They don't." Tom looked at her. Martha looked at the sunset. And in the space between his question and her non-answer, something unspoken hung in the air like heat lightning, visible but not yet ready to strike. Martha already knew exactly who Sachiko's husband was. She had found out 6 days earlier on an afternoon so hot that the air itself seemed to be sweating. Sachiko had been working the fence line all morning in boots that did not fit. They were camp issued a size too large, and the friction had raised blisters that had become infected. By afternoon, she was limping. Martha noticed and commanded her into the kitchen with the same tone she used for everything. "Sit down. Show me your feet." Sachiko hesitated. Then she sat and removed her right boot. The sock was spotted with blood. But as the boot came off, something else fell to the kitchen floor with a small, flat sound. A photograph. It landed face up on the wooden boards between them. Martha bent to pick it up before Sachiko could move. And Sachiko's composure, the composure she had maintained through 3 years of internment, through the death of her husband, through bombs and surrender, and the daily humiliation of being an enemy in a country she had chosen as home, that composure shattered. Her hand shot out a "please, no." Her voice cracked on the second word. Martha looked at the photograph. A young Japanese man in a United States Army uniform. The insignia on his shoulder was unmistakable. The Torch of Liberty, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Behind him, an American flag. On the back, in careful English handwriting, "For Sachiko and Yumi, I fight for the country that is your home. Kenji Camp Shelby, 1943. Martha stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Sachiko. Sachiko's eyes were wet. Her hands were shaking. This was the most vulnerable Martha had ever seen her, more vulnerable than any moment of physical labor or hunger or exhaustion. Because this photograph was everything. It was proof that her husband had fought for America. And it was a weapon that could be used against her by anyone who chose to see a Japanese face in an American uniform as evidence of espionage rather than loyalty. "Your husband was a soldier," Martha said quietly. "An American soldier. Sachiko nodded. She could not speak. 442nd. Martha knew the number. Every Texan did. He fought in Europe. He died in Europe, Sachiko whispered. October. The Vosges, saving the men who were trapped. Martha sat down slowly. The Lost Battalion. Texas boys. Saved by Japanese-American soldiers. And one of those soldiers was the husband of the woman sitting in her kitchen with bleeding feet and terrified eyes. Please do not tell Mr. Hargrove, Sachiko said. Please do not tell Sergeant Jennings. If Jennings learns I have military connections, he will use it against me. He will say Kenji joined the army to spy. He will say I am a threat. That is absurd, Martha said. Mrs. Hargrove, I have lived 3 years in a prison camp while my husband fought for this country. Nothing is absurd anymore. Martha looked at the photograph one more time. Then she placed it in the pocket of her apron. I won't tell. Not yet. The word yet hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and warning both. She treated Sachiko's blistered feet with iodine and clean bandages. Neither woman spoke again about the photograph that afternoon. But from that moment, Martha carried it with her every day, waiting for the right moment to show it to Tom. Waiting the way she waited for biscuit dough to rise because she understood timing. You do not open the oven until the heat has done its work. And Tom Hargrove was not yet done rising. The second week brought the kitchen, Martha's domain, the place where the Hargrove women had conducted the real business of the family for 3 generations, while the men believed the real business was happening in the pastures. Martha did not invite Sachiko into the kitchen. She commanded her. Wash your hands and help me with this, Martha said one afternoon, standing over a pot of chicken and dumplings that was large enough to suggest she had been planning for 4 mouths all along. Sachiko entered the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and stood beside Martha at the counter. Martha worked the dough. Her hands moved with the unconscious confidence of a woman who had made this recipe so many times it had become an extension of her body. Flour, water, salt, a touch of butter. Knead. Fold. Knead again. The dough became smooth and elastic under her palms. Sachiko watched. Then her hands began to move. She took a portion of dough and began working it with a technique that was different from Martha's, but aimed at the same destination. Her fingers pressed and folded with a rhythm that came from somewhere else, somewhere across an ocean, somewhere where women stood in kitchens and transformed flour and water into nourishment, with the same ancient knowledge that women everywhere have carried since the first grain was ground between stones. Martha glanced at Sachiko's hands. You've made noodles before. Udon, Sachiko said. In Japan. Martha nodded. Same idea. Dough is dough. They worked in silence after that. 2 women from opposite sides of a war, standing shoulder to shoulder in a Texas kitchen, their hands white with flour, the pot simmering on the stove, the smell of chicken broth rising like a prayer. No words were necessary. The kitchen was its own language, older than English, older than Japanese, a language spoken in the rhythm of chopping and stirring, and the ancient silence of women who understand that feeding people is the most radical act of love. Yumi sat under the table drawing on the wooden floor with a piece of chalk Ortiz had given her. Dusty lay beside her, his tail occasionally sweeping across her artwork, erasing a line here, a circle there. Yumi did not mind. She simply drew over the dog's corrections. When the food was ready, Martha set 4 places at the table. 4 plates, 4 sets of silverware, 4 glasses of sweet tea. She did this without comment, without ceremony, without looking at Tom to see if he would object. She simply set the table for the number of people who were going to eat, and the fact that this number was 4 for the first time since Billy died was a fact she left for Tom to absorb on his own. Tom came in from the porch. He saw the 4 places. He saw Sachiko and Yumi already seated. He saw his son's chair, the 4th chair, and in it sat a Japanese woman with flour still dusting her forearms and posture that would not bend. His jaw tightened, but he sat. He ate. The chicken and dumplings were perfect, as Martha's always were. The broth was rich and deep, the dumplings soft and yielding, the chicken pulled into tender strands that dissolved on the tongue. Comfort food. The food Martha made when someone was sick, when someone was sad, when someone needed to be reminded that the world still contained things worth tasting. Sachiko ate slowly, and if her eyes grew bright for a moment, If she blinked once too many times, if the taste of this simple American comfort food transported her to a small apartment in Sacramento where a man named Kenji used to stand at the stove and hum while he cooked. No one at the table mentioned it. Some things are visible but not meant to be acknowledged. Some tears are not shed but felt, and the feeling is a private country that no one else has a visa to enter. After supper, after the truck had carried Sachiko and Yumi back to Crystal City, Martha stood at the sink washing dishes. Tom dried. They worked in the rhythm of a couple who has done this 10,000 times. She has good hands, Martha said. I noticed. She fixed that calf like a doctor. I said I noticed. Martha handed him a plate. Tom, there's something I need to tell you. Not tonight, but soon. He looked at her. She looked at the soap suds. And the thing she was not yet saying sat between them like a fourth presence at the table, patient and heavy and waiting for its moment. Then the world changed. August 6th, 1945. The radio in the kitchen crackled with the news at 8 in the morning. Martha stood beside the table, her hand on the back of a chair. Tom sat with his coffee. The announcer's voice carried the gravity reserved for events that will be remembered for centuries. A new weapon, a single bomb, an entire city destroyed. Hiroshima, a word that had meant nothing to most Americans 12 hours ago and would now mean everything forever. Tom listened. His face did not change. Inside, behind the wall, a thought formed with the cold clarity of a man who has been feeding his hatred for months. Good. They deserved it. This was the thought. It arrived fully formed and absolutely certain, and Tom held it in his mind the way you hold a stone, feeling its weight, its solidity, its simplicity. Then he looked through the kitchen window. Yumi was in the yard, crouching beside an anthill, watching the insects carry crumbs 10 times their own weight, with the fascinated concentration that only children and scientists possess. Dusty lay nearby, uninterested in ants, but fully committed to being wherever Yumi was. They deserved it. The thought was still there. But now it had a crack in it, and through the crack he could see a 5-year-old girl watching ants, and the thought could not hold both itself and the image of the child at the same time. One of them had to give way. Tom finished his coffee and went outside without resolving the contradiction, because resolving it would require becoming someone he was not yet ready to be. Sachiko received the news from Private Ortiz, who ran to the cattle barn where she was working with all the breathless urgency of a 19-year-old who has not yet learned that some news should be delivered gently. Miss Tanaka? They dropped a bomb on Japan, a whole city. Hiroshima. Sachiko stopped. The shovel she was holding hung in the air, suspended between one motion and the next. Hiroshima. Her family was not in Hiroshima. Her family was in Kobe, 300 kilometers away. But Kobe had already been firebombed in March. She had received no word from her parents, her sister, her childhood friends since 1941. 4 years of silence. 4 years of not knowing whether the people who raised her still existed. She set the shovel down with the careful deliberation of someone who knows that if she does not control this one small physical action, she will lose control of everything. She walked behind the barn. She sat on the ground with her back against the wooden wall, and she shook. Not crying, shaking, her whole body vibrating with a frequency that was beyond grief, beyond fear. Somewhere in the territory where the body takes over because the mind has reached the limit of what it can process. She was sitting on Texas soil, an enemy's soil, being fed by enemies, working for enemies. And her homeland, the country where she learned to walk and speak and read and fall in love, that country had just been struck by a weapon so terrible that the radio announcer's voice had trembled while describing it. She did not know if her mother was alive. She did not know if Kobe was next. She did not know anything except that she was shaking and could not stop, and the Texas heat pressed against her like a hand trying to hold her together. Martha found her 20 minutes later. Martha did not speak. She sat down on the ground beside Sachiko, her back against the same barn wall, her legs stretched out in the dust. 2 women sitting in the dirt behind a barn in Texas while the world burned on the other side of the ocean. Martha reached over and placed her hand on Sachiko's forearm. Not a pat, not a squeeze, just contact. Just the plain physical fact of one human being touching another and saying without words, I am here. I see you. You are not alone in this. They sat like that for a long time. The heat shimmered over the pastures. The cattle moved slowly in the distance. Dusty appeared around the corner of the barn, assessed the situation with the wisdom of a very old dog, and lay down across both women's feet as if to anchor them to the earth. 3 days later, Nagasaki, the second bomb. And this time it was Tom who found Sachiko. She had not come to the afternoon work shift. Tom walked the property looking for her and found her in the horse stall, brushing the old mare with slow mechanical strokes. Her hand moved the brush in the same rhythm over and over, as if the repetition could create a reality more bearable than the one the radio kept delivering. Her eyes were focused on nothing. Tanaka. She did not turn. Tanaka. The west fence still isn't done. She turned. Her eyes were dry but red. Mr. Hargrove, my family is in Kobe. I have not heard from them since 1941. Do you know if Kobe was like Hiroshima? The question stopped him. This was the first time Sachiko had asked him anything personal. The first time she had opened the door between professional, distance, and human need. He could see the effort it cost her. The way her jaw tightened after the words came out as if she wanted to pull them back, as if asking was a weakness she could not afford. I don't know, Tom said. Then before his mind could prevent it, before the wall could reassert itself, I'll ask. The words left his mouth like birds escaping a cage. Unauthorized, unplanned. He had just promised to find information for a Japanese woman about her family in a country he had been celebrating the bombing of 3 days ago. The contradiction was so enormous that his brain simply refused to process it, filed it away in the same locked drawer where Billy's letter waited, and moved on. He turned and walked away. But the promise hung in the air behind him, small and impossible, and already beginning to change the shape of everything. 3 days later, Tom drove to the general store in town and asked Rodriguez, the postman, whether there was any way to get information about specific cities in Japan. Rodriguez knew a man at the Red Cross office in San Antonio. Tom called. The Red Cross could not confirm individual families, but they could tell him this Kobe had been firebombed in March 1945. Roughly a third of the city had been destroyed. But Kobe had not been hit by an atomic bomb. Parts of the city survived. Some neighborhoods were intact. Tom drove back to the ranch. He found Sachiko in the barn mending a bridle. He stood in the doorway. Kobe wasn't hit like Hiroshima, he said. Firebombed in March, yes, but still standing. Some of it, he paused. The Red Cross can't say about your family specifically. But the city is there. Sachiko's hand stopped moving on the leather. She did not look up for several seconds. When she did, her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady. Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. Tom nodded, turned, left. Neither of them acknowledged that this small act, a Texas rancher calling the Red Cross to ask about a Japanese city for a Japanese woman, was the most radical thing Tom Hargrove had ever done. More radical than enlisting at 17. More radical than agreeing to let the enemy onto his land. Because this was not duty or necessity. This was choice. Pure, voluntary, unauthorized kindness towards someone he was supposed to hate. August 15th. The war ended. Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and strange, broadcast over radios across the world, speaking words that no Japanese emperor had ever spoken. Surrender. The divine wind had stopped blowing. The empire of the rising sun had set. In the small towns around Crystal City, Texas, the celebration erupted like a fever breaking. Car horns, gunshots fired into the sky, church bells, strangers embracing on street corners, flags waving from every porch and window. The war was over. The boys are coming home. America had won. Martha stood in the kitchen and cried, not from joy. The war ending did not bring Billy back. Victory was an abstraction. Her son's absence was concrete. She cried for the gap between what the nation was feeling and what she was feeling, the unbridgeable distance between public triumph and private loss. Tom sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey and watched the distant celebration. Fireworks rising over the town like tiny brief suns. He did not participate. He did not feel victory. He felt the emptiness of a man who has been sustained by rage and now faces the prospect of rage without a target. The Japanese had surrendered. The enemy had admitted defeat, and Billy was still dead. The rage had nowhere to go, so it turned inward, and the whiskey helped it settle into a dull, constant ache instead of the sharp, motivating fury it had been before. Sachiko heard the news in Martha's kitchen, where she had been preparing the evening meal. She stood perfectly still for 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, a lifetime of emotion compressed itself into a single unbearable point. Relief because the bombs would stop. Grief because everything lost was now confirmed as permanent. Shame because she was standing in an enemy's kitchen when her nation fell. And fear, the deepest fear. Because now that the war was over, the word she had been dreading would come. Repatriation, the camps would close. The internees would be processed. Those with American citizenship would be released. Those without the Japanese nationals, the issei, the wives who had followed their husbands across the ocean only to be imprisoned by the country they had chosen, those people would be sent back. Back to a Japan that had been firebombed, atomic bombed, starved, and defeated. Back to cities that might no longer exist. Back to families that might no longer be alive. Sachiko was a Japanese national. She had never been allowed to become an American citizen. The law prohibited it. The Asian Exclusion Act. A law that said her face disqualified her from belonging, no matter how long she lived here, no matter that her husband had died in an American uniform, no matter that her daughter had been born on American soil. Yumi was an American citizen, born in Sacramento, protected by the 14th Amendment. They could not deport Yumi, but they could deport Sachiko. And then what? Take a 5-year-old from her mother, or send an American child to a destroyed country she had never seen. This was not a choice. This was a punishment designed to look like a choice. And Sachiko, standing in Martha Hargrove's kitchen with a wooden spoon in her hand and the sound of distant celebration coming through the open window, understood that the end of the war was not the end of her war. Her war was just beginning. Jennings arrived at the ranch 2 weeks later. The smile was the same, but the energy behind it had shifted. He moved with the brisk efficiency of a man who finally had the authority to do what he had been planning all along. He sat across from Tom at the kitchen table. Martha stood by the stove. Sachiko was outside working. Yumi was with Dusty as always. Mr. Hargrove, the war is over. The labor program will be terminated at the end of October. Miss Tanaka has been scheduled for repatriation on the November transport. The words landed on the table like something heavy dropped from a height. Tom set down his coffee cup. November, Japan right now. She has a small daughter. Her daughter is an American citizen, Jennings said pleasantly. Miss Tanaka may choose to leave the child in the United States under the care of a guardian, or she may take the child with her. That is her decision. Separate a mother from a 5-year-old, or send a 5-year-old American citizen to a country in ruins. Tom stared at Jennings and saw for the first time the machinery behind the smile. This was not justice. This was not even cruelty in the traditional sense, the kind that comes from anger or malice. This was something colder. This was the cruelty of systems of paperwork, of categories that sort human beings into columns on a ledger and dispose of them according to rules that were written by people who never had to look into the face of the disposed. Whose decision is this? Tom asked. The system's, Mr. Hargrove. I'm just the one who carries it out. Jennings reached into his wallet. He pulled out a photograph, small, creased, worn at the edges from years of handling. He laid it on the table. A young man in a military uniform, painfully thin, hollow-eyed, ribs visible through a shirt that hung on his frame like cloth draped over sticks. The photograph had been taken in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. The young man weighed by the look of him less than 90 pounds. His eyes stared at the camera with the vacant, exhausted gaze of someone who has gone past suffering into a territory beyond it. My brother Danny, Jennings said. Baton. This is the last photograph taken of him before he died. He weighed 84 pounds. Do you know what 84 pounds looks like on a grown man, Mr. Hargrove? It looks like a skeleton wearing skin. It looks like something that is no longer entirely human. The Japanese did this to him, not all Japanese, not Sachiko Tanaka specifically, but the Japanese, his captors, his torturers, the people who starved him and beat him and left him to die of dysentery in a bamboo cage. Jennings placed his finger on the photograph. I look at this picture every night, every single night, and every morning I wake up and do my job. My job is to make sure the system works. My job is to process these people according to the law, not according to feelings, not according to sympathy, according to the law. Tom looked at the photograph of Danny Jennings. He looked at the man across the table, and he understood something about Jennings that he had not understood before. Jennings was not evil. Jennings was not even cruel in the way Tom had assumed. Jennings was a man in pain who had found a way to convert his pain into purpose. The paperwork, the assessments, the calm and methodical processing of Japanese internees for repatriation. This was Jennings's version of Tom's whiskey. It was the thing that got him through the night. It was the story he told himself so that Danny's death meant something, so that the suffering had a consequence, so that the universe operated according to rules that could be understood and enforced. And that made him more dangerous than any simple villain. Because Jennings believed he was right, because his pain was real, because his brother had really died at 84 pounds in a Japanese prison camp, and because a man who does terrible things for reasons he sincerely believes are just as far harder to stop than a man who knows he is doing wrong. After Jennings left, Tom stood on the porch for a long time. The sun was going down. The sky burned orange and red along the horizon, that Texas sunset that looks like the whole world is on fire. Dusty lay at his feet. In the distance, the military truck carrying Sachiko and Yumi back to Crystal City raised a plume of dust that hung in the still air long after the vehicle disappeared. Martha came out, stood beside him, did not speak. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. Full of the photograph of Danny Jennings at 84 pounds. Full of the calendar counting down to November. Full of a 5-year-old girl who might be torn from her mother or sent to a country made of rubble. "He's going to send her back," Tom said. "Yes. She saved your life, Martha." "I know. And Yumi." He stopped. The child's name in his mouth felt like something fragile, something he might break if he held it too tightly. "Yumi is American." "Born in Sacramento," Martha said quietly. "If this story has reached something inside you, take a moment to hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this only survive if people choose to pass them on, the same way a recipe survives only if someone teaches it to the next pair of hands." Tom was silent for a moment. Then her husband, the one who died in Europe. "Who was he, Martha?" Martha did not answer immediately. The rocker creaked. A nighthawk called from somewhere over the pasture. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the photograph she had been carrying for weeks, waiting for this moment, the way a farmer waits for rain, knowing it will come but unable to force it. She handed the photograph to Tom. He held it up to the fading light. A young Japanese man in a United States Army uniform. The insignia on his shoulder was clear. The Torch of Liberty, the patch of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Behind the man, an American flag. On the back, written in English in a hand that was careful and precise. "For Sachiko and Yumi, I fight for the country that is your home. Kenji Camp Shelby, 1943. Tom stared at the photograph. The world tilted, quietly, completely, irreversibly. "Her husband was an American soldier," Martha said. Tom said nothing. His eyes moved from the insignia to the face to the flag and back to the insignia. 442nd Regimental Combat Team," Martha continued. "Kenji Tanaka, Nisei, born in Sacramento, volunteered in 1943. Deployed to Europe. Killed in action October 1944. In the Vosges Mountains. In France." She paused. "During the rescue of the Lost Battalion." The Lost Battalion. Tom knew. Every Texan knew. The 1st Battalion, 141st Regiment, 36th Infantry Division. Texas boys. Surrounded by Germans in the Vosges forest. Cut off. Running out of food, water, ammunition. Dying. And the unit that was sent to rescue them, the unit that fought through 5 days of brutal combat and suffered over 800 casualties to save 211 trapped Texans, was the 442nd, the Japanese-American Regiment, the Nisei. Kenji Tanaka had died saving Texas soldiers, the same Texas that had imprisoned his wife and daughter behind barbed wire while he bled out in a French forest wearing the uniform of the country that refused to give his wife citizenship. Martha's voice was steady, but her hands were not. "He died for Texas boys, Tom, and his wife is in a camp in Texas, and the man who wants to send her back to Japan lost his brother to Japanese cruelty. And our son, who died fighting the Japanese, wrote in his last letter that the Japanese saved his life." She stopped, breathed. "Tell me this makes sense. Tell me any of this makes sense." It did not make sense. Nothing made sense. The categories that had held Tom's world together, enemy and ally, Japanese and American hatred and love, guilt and innocence, collapsed like a fence in a flood. Because the story was no longer simple. The story had never been simple. And Tom Hargrove, standing on his porch holding a photograph of a dead Japanese-American soldier, while the sunset burned the sky to ash, understood for the first time that the war had not been fought between nations. It had been fought inside every single human being who participated in it. And it was still being fought, right here, right now, inside him. He slid the photograph into his shirt pocket. He did not give it back to Martha. "There's more," Martha said. "Billy's letter. I know what the letter says. You read the first line and stopped." "I know what it says, Martha." "You don't. You know what the first line says. You don't know what the rest says, and you need to. Not tomorrow, not someday. You need to read it before Jennings comes back. Before November. Before they take that woman and that child and put them on a boat to a country that no longer exists." Tom gripped the porch railing. His knuckles were white. Dusty pressed against his legs, sensing the tremor that was running through his master's body like a current through wire. "Not tonight," Tom said. Martha accepted this. She had learned the geography of her husband's grief well enough to know which borders could be pushed and which would hold. Tonight was a border that would hold, but the territory beyond it was shrinking. November was coming. The clock was ticking, and the letter in the locked drawer was running out of patience. That night, Tom did not go to the barn. He sat on the porch with Dusty and looked at the stars and held the photograph of Kenji Tanaka against his chest in the same pocket where he used to keep Billy's school picture. 2 soldiers, 2 dead men, 2 families destroyed by the same war from opposite sides. He did not drink. For the first time in months, the bottle stayed in the barn, and Tom stayed on the porch, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the coyotes sang their ancient, indifferent song, and somewhere in Crystal City, Sachiko Tanaka lay awake in her narrow cot, wondering if she would be sent back to a country she no longer recognized, wondering if her daughter would be taken from her or taken with her, wondering if the rancher who could not look her in the eye would remember that he had promised to ask about Kobe. He had asked. The city was still there, some of it, and the promise, small as it was, had cracked something open that could not be closed again. Then in the last week of September, the snake came. Martha was in the vegetable garden behind the house. The green beans needed picking. She moved between the rows with a basket on her hip, bending and straightening the ancient rhythm of harvest. The afternoon sun pressed down like a weight. The air was thick with the smell of warm earth and ripening vegetables and the faint sweet rot of overripe tomatoes that had split on the vine. She did not see the rattlesnake. A western diamondback coiled in the shade of the bean plants, its pattern blending perfectly with the dry soil. She stepped near the edge of the row and the snake struck. The impact hit her calf like a fist. She screamed. The sound cut through the afternoon silence like something breaking. Tom was in the far pasture a quarter-mile away. He did not hear. Ortiz was in the truck, windows up, dreaming of El Paso. He did not hear. Sachiko was 30 meters away, scattering feed for the chickens. She heard. She dropped the feed bucket and ran. Not the panicked run of someone reacting to a scream, but the directed, purposeful run of someone whose training had been activated. She reached Martha in seconds. Martha was on the ground, her face white with shock, her hand gripping her calf, where 2 puncture marks wept blood. The snake was already retreating into the garden, its rattle buzzing with the dry, mechanical menace of a sound designed by evolution to say, "Do not follow me." Sachiko did not follow the snake. She dropped to her knees beside Martha, and her hands began to move with the speed and precision of a woman who had spent 2 years training in a hospital in Kobe before she married before the war, before her life became a series of destructions she could not prevent, but this she could treat. Assessment first. 2 puncture marks, rapid swelling, rattlesnake, envenomation. Time was critical. She spoke to Martha in a voice that was calm and firm and absolutely without panic. "Mrs. Hargrove, do not move. Moving spreads the venom faster. Lie back. I am going to help you." She cut a strip from her own shirt with a kitchen knife she pulled from Martha's gardening basket. She fashioned a compression bandage around the wound site firm enough to slow lymphatic spread, but not tight enough to cut circulation. She did not slash the wound. She did not attempt to suck out the venom. She did not apply a tourniquet. These were the mistakes that untrained people made, mistakes that killed as many snakebite victims as the venom itself. Sachiko made none of them. She elevated Martha's leg on the overturned feed bucket. She monitored Martha's pulse at the wrist. She shouted toward the truck until Ortiz finally startled awake and stumbled out, his comic book falling to the dirt. "We need the vehicle." "The medical station at Crystal City. Now, drive fast." Ortiz drove as if the road itself were chasing him. Sachiko rode in the back with Martha, one hand maintaining pressure on the bandage, the other checking Martha's pulse every 30 seconds. Martha was shaking. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The pain was building, radiating up from her calf in waves that made her vision blur. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Sachiko's voice cut through the pain like a blade through cloth. "Look at me. Breathe slowly, in through your nose, out through your mouth. You are going to be fine." Martha looked into Sachiko's eyes and saw something she had never seen there before. Not the careful composure, not the professional distance. She saw the full focused force of a woman who had decided that this person was not going to die. Not today. Not on her watch. It was the look of a nurse who has lost patients before and carries each loss like a stone in her pocket and will not add another stone today. They reached the military medical station at Crystal City in 18 minutes. The Army doctor worked quickly, administering anti-venom, cleaning the wound, monitoring vital signs. When it was over, when Martha was stable, and the danger had passed, the doctor found Tom in the hallway. Tom had arrived 2 hours late, having run to the truck, when Ortiz returned and driven to Crystal City at a speed that left the road's gravel rattled for days. "Your wife is going to be fine," the doctor said. "The initial treatment saved her. Whoever bandaged that wound knew exactly what they were doing. Without proper first aid, she could have lost the leg. Or worse." Tom looked through the doorway of the treatment room. Martha lay on a cot, pale but alive. And beside her on a metal chair sat Sachiko Tanaka Yumi, asleep on her lap, Martha's dried blood still dark on the sleeves of her torn shirt. Sachiko's eyes were closed, not sleeping, resting, the way a soldier rests between engagements, conserving energy for whatever comes next. Tom walked into the room. He stood there. Sachiko opened her eyes. They looked at each other. Neither spoke. The silence was not empty. It was enormous. It contained the weight of every meal shared at the table, every fence repaired side by side, every word not spoken, every assumption shattered, every brick knocked from the wall that Tom had built between himself and the possibility that this woman was not his enemy. He sat down, on the bench across from her. Close. He did not leave. He still did not say thank you. The words were there, pressing against the inside of his mouth like prisoners against a gate. But saying them would mean acknowledging something larger than gratitude. It would mean acknowledging that he owed his wife's life to a Japanese woman, that the hands that saved Martha were the same hands that belonged to a people he had sworn to hate, that the categories were not just cracked now, but collapsed entirely. So he sat, and Sachiko sat, and Yumi slept on her mother's lap with the absolute peace of a child who does not understand the wars being fought above her head. And in the fluorescent silence of the Crystal City medical station, two people who had never had a real conversation sat together and said nothing and meant everything. That night, after they brought Martha home, after Sachiko and Yumi were returned to camp, after the house was dark and Martha was asleep with her bandaged leg elevated on pillows, Tom went to the barn. The bottle was there. The photograph of Billy was there. The rifle was in the corner where it always stood. Tom sat on the overturned feed bucket. He did not reach for the bottle. He reached for it, stopped, reached again. His hand hung in the air between the whiskey and nothing, trembling with the effort of a man fighting himself. He picked up the bottle, unscrewed the cap, brought it to his lips. Then he set it down, picked up the photograph of Billy instead, looked at his son's face, 10 years old, on horseback, grinning with 2 missing teeth. "She saved your mother, Billy. The Japanese woman saved your mother." He put the photograph down, picked up the bottle again, drank. The whiskey burned, and the burn felt like an answer, the wrong answer, but an answer. He drank more, and the anger came, not at Sachiko, not at Martha, at himself, for caring, for feeling the wall crack, for allowing a Japanese woman and her 5-year-old daughter to sit in Billy's chair and eat his bacon and fix his fences and save his wife and slowly, irrevocably become people to him instead of enemies. He stood, the barn tilted. He looked at the rifle in the corner, looked at it the way a drowning man looks at deep water, knowing it will kill him, feeling the pull anyway. He did not want to hurt anyone. He wanted to hurt something. A fence, a wall, the silence, the grief. He wanted to destroy something because destruction was easier than the feeling that was building inside him, the feeling that had no name but felt like everything falling at once, and the wind coming through the gaps, and the terrible, beautiful, unbearable vulnerability of a man who has run out of hatred and does not yet know what comes next. He picked up the rifle, set it down, picked it up. The metal was cold. Dusty barked. One small bark, not alarm, concern. The old dog sat at Tom's feet and looked up at him with eyes that had watched this man for 12 years. Eyes that had seen him laugh and cry and rage and celebrate and mourn. Eyes that did not judge, because dogs have no use for judgment, only loyalty and the ancient wordless understanding that sometimes a human being needs to be reminded that they are not alone. Tom looked at the dog looked at Tom, and something in that exchange and the patient, worried, utterly devoted gaze of an old hound who had never once in 12 years failed to be present when his master needed him. Something in that look reached the place inside Tom that the whiskey could not reach, and the rifle could not destroy, and the hatred could not fill. He put the rifle down. He sat on the floor of the barn. He put his arms around Dusty. And Thomas Hargrove, third generation, Texas rancher, veteran father of a dead soldier, a man who had not cried since the telegram arrived 3 months ago, buried his face in the fur of his old dog and wept. Not whiskey tears, not rage tears. These were the tears of a man who had reached the bottom of his own darkness and found there in the deepest and most frightening place not hatred but exhaustion. He was tired of hating, tired of the wall, tired of locking drawers and avoiding letters and cooking breakfast for an empty chair. Tired of being the man the war had made him instead of the man his son had asked him to be. He cried until there was nothing left, until the barn was dark and the stars were out, and Dusty's fur was wet, and the whiskey bottle stood untouched where he had set it down. He did not drink again that night. He lay on the barn floor with his dog and stared at the ceiling and felt for the first time since Billy died the terrifying, liberating, annihilating relief of a man whose wall has finally fallen and who is lying in the rubble wondering what he will build in its place. In the house, Martha lay awake. She had heard him go to the barn. She had waited for the sound of the bottle, the sound of his voice talking to Billy's photograph, the familiar soundtrack of his nightly destruction. Instead, she heard something she had not heard in months. She heard her husband crying. And Martha Hargrove, who had been waiting with the patience of a woman who understands that some things cannot be forced, but only witnessed, closed her eyes and let her own tears come quiet and grateful, because she knew that the sound of Tom crying was not the sound of breaking. It was the sound of beginning. 2 days passed before Tom opened the drawer. 2 days of working the ranch in a silence that felt different from the silence before. Before, the silence had been a wall. Now it was a space, an empty room waiting to be furnished with something he had not yet chosen. Martha did not push. She moved through the house with her bandaged leg and her practical grace, cooking and cleaning and watching her husband the way a woman watches weather on the horizon, reading the signs, trusting the timing. She had planted the seeds. The photograph of Kenji was in Tom's shirt pocket. The knowledge that Sachiko's husband had died saving Texas soldiers was in his mind. Now the last piece waited in the locked drawer, and Martha knew that Tom would open it when the weight of not knowing finally exceeded the weight of knowing. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Sachiko and Yumi had gone back to Crystal City. Martha was resting on the sofa with her leg elevated, reading a newspaper she had already read twice. Tom came in from the porch. He did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way he did when he was working through something too large for words. "Where's the key?" he said. Not a question, a surrender. Martha did not look up from the newspaper. Ammunition box, top shelf above the desk, where it's always been. He walked to the desk, found the box, found the key. The metal was cold and small in his calloused fingers. He unlocked the drawer. The letter sat where he had placed it 3 months ago, the paper slightly yellowed, one corner bent, from when he had shoved it inside with hands that were shaking too badly to be gentle. He picked it up, carried it to the kitchen table, sat in his chair. Martha set down the newspaper and limped to the table and sat across from him because some things should not be done alone, even when the person doing them believes they must be. Tom unfolded the letter. Billy's handwriting. The letter's slightly uneven because Billy had always gripped the pen too hard, pressing down as if he could push the words deeper into the paper by force. Tom had tried to correct this when Billy was young. Martha had told him to leave the boy alone. She was right, as she usually was, about things that mattered. He read the first line again, the line that had stopped him cold 3 months ago. "Dad, I have to tell you about the Japanese soldiers who saved my life." He breathed. He kept reading. Billy wrote from Okinawa. He wrote about heat and mud and the constant sound of artillery that became so normal, it was the silence that woke you up at night. He wrote about the food, which was terrible, and the mosquitoes, which were worse, and the kid from Ohio named Schumacher who could imitate any bird call so perfectly that the actual birds would answer him, which provided the only entertainment available in a foxhole at 3 in the morning. Then the letter changed. Billy wrote about the Nisei, the Japanese Americans serving in military intelligence, translators, interrogators, men who looked like the enemy but wore American uniforms and carried American weapons and spoke Japanese because it was the language their mothers had sung to them as babies in California and Oregon and Washington and Hawaii. Billy wrote about a man named Sergeant Hayashi. He was Nisei from San Jose. His parents ran a nursery that grew roses. His parents had been sent to an internment camp in Utah while their son was shipped to the Pacific to fight against the country of his ancestors. Hayashi never talked about it. He did his work. He translated captured documents. He interrogated prisoners with a courtesy that confused both the Americans and the Japanese because it belonged to neither world entirely, but bridged them both. One night, Billy wrote Hayashi translated a map found on a dead Japanese officer. The map showed the positions of a network of tunnels and bunkers that Billy's platoon was scheduled to advance through the following morning. Without the translation, they would have walked directly into an ambush. Every man in the platoon would have died. Because of Hayashi's work, they changed their route. They lived. 23 men who went home to their families because a Japanese-American sergeant from San Jose could read a dead man's map. Billy wrote, "Dad Hayashi saved my life, and he saved 22 other lives, and nobody will ever know his name. He doesn't want recognition. He doesn't want a medal. He told me he just wants to go home after the war and grow roses like his parents. But his parents' nursery was confiscated when they were sent to the camp. There's nothing to go home to. He saves American lives every day, and his reward is the knowledge that the country he's saving doesn't want him back." Then Billy wrote the lines that Martha had memorized and carried inside her like a second heartbeat for 3 months. "Dad, I know you hate the Japanese. I understand why. They are trying to kill me every day, and some days they almost succeed, and I am scared in a way I cannot describe to you because you taught me that Hargrove men don't use the word scared. But I am. I am scared, and I am tired, and I miss the ranch, and I miss Dusty, and I miss Mom's biscuits, and I miss sitting on the porch with you watching the sun go down. But I need to tell you something that I have learned out here in this mud, and this blood, and this noise. There is no such thing as the Japanese. There is no such thing as the Americans. There are only people. Some of them are trying to kill me, and some of them are saving my life, and the ones trying to kill me have Japanese faces and American faces both. And the ones saving my life have American faces and Japanese faces both. I have learned that evil does not have a nationality, and neither does courage. The 442nd Dad, the Nisei Regiment fighting in Europe. I heard about them from Hayashi. They volunteer to fight for America while their families sit behind barbed wire in American camps. I do not know if that is bravery or madness, but I know it is the most courageous thing I have ever heard of. They fight for a country that is imprisoning their mothers and fathers and wives and children. If that is not love of country, then there is no such thing. If I don't come home, Dad, remember this. Don't hate anyone because of their face. I have seen faces that look like the enemy, but belong to heroes. And I have seen faces that look like friends, but belong to cowards. Faces tell you nothing. Only actions, only what a person does when it would be easier to do nothing or to do wrong. I love you, Dad. Tell Mom I love her. Give Dusty a scratch behind the ears for me. And when you sit on the porch and watch the sunset, save me a seat. I'll be there. One way or another, I'll be there. Tom finished the letter. He set it on the table. He placed both hands flat on the wood and pressed down as if the table might fly away if he did not anchor it. His eyes were open, but he was not seeing the kitchen. He was seeing Billy. Not Billy at 10 on a horse. Not Billy at 18 at the bus station. Billy at 21 in a foxhole in Okinawa, writing by flashlight, with a pen gripped too hard, putting down the truest words he would ever write in the last days of his life. Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over Tom's. She did not speak. There was nothing to add. Billy had said everything. Tom sat for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. Dusty sighed in his sleep by the stove. The night pressed against the windows. Then Tom stood up. He walked to the porch. He looked up at the Texas sky, clear and cold, and dense with stars that had been burning since before there were nations or wars or reasons to hate. He was holding the letter, not the whiskey, the letter. And somewhere in the constellation of grief and revelation and the terrible clarity that comes when you realize your dead son was wiser than you will ever be, Tom Hargrove made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind that comes with music and speeches, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when a man puts one foot in front of the other in a new direction and does not look back. He was going to fight for Sachiko and Yumi, not because he loved them, not because he had forgiven the war, but because his son had asked him to judge by actions, not faces. And the action before him was clear. A woman who had saved his wife's life was going to be sent to die in the ruins of a country that no longer existed. A child who was an American citizen was going to lose her mother or her country, and the man with the authority to prevent it was sitting behind a desk with a photograph of his dead brother and a pen that could sign away 2 lives with a single stroke. Tom was going to fight, not with fists, not with a rifle, with the only weapons that worked against the system paper truth and the stubborn refusal of a Texas rancher to accept that the rules were more important than the people they were written to protect. He started the next morning. He called on Reverend Dawson first. The old pastor listened to everything, the letter, the photograph of Kenji, the looming repatriation, and nodded slowly with the gravity of a man who has spent 50 years mediating between human nature and divine expectation, and knows that the distance between the two is where the real work of living happens. "What do you need from me?" Dawson asked. "A letter, your signature. Your name carries weight in this county. You'll have it by tomorrow." Tom visited Doc Carter next, the veterinarian who had treated Hargrove cattle for 20 years. Carter wrote a statement confirming Sachiko's medical knowledge and her role in saving Martha's life. "Best field treatment I've seen outside an Army hospital," Carter wrote. "This woman is an asset to any community fortunate enough to have her." Tom gathered documents. Kenji's military service records, which Martha obtained through a contact at the War Department, a clerk who owed a favor to Martha's cousin in Washington. Yumi's birth certificate from Sacramento. The formal death notification for Private First Class Kenji Tanaka, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, killed in action. October 1944, Vosges Mountains, France, during the rescue of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Division. The 36th Division, the Texas Division. Tom held that document and felt the full weight of its meaning settle into his bones. Kenji Tanaka had died saving Texans, and Texas was about to send his widow to her death. Then Tom did something he had not done since Billy's funeral. He put on his good shirt, his clean trousers, his best Stetson. He polished his boots, he shaved, he looked at himself in the mirror, and saw a man he barely recognized, not because he had changed on the outside, but because the man inside had shifted the way the earth shifts after a quake, the same surface but everything underneath rearranged. Martha watched him dress. "You look like you're going to church." "Something like that." "Tom." She caught his arm as he reached for his hat. "Be careful with Jennings. He's not a bad man. He's a hurt man. And hurt men are the most dangerous when you threaten the thing that makes their hurt feel meaningful." Tom nodded. He kissed her forehead, the first kiss in months. Martha closed her eyes and held the moment the way you hold a match in the wind, gently and completely, and with the knowledge that it could go out at any second. But before Tom went to Crystal City, he had one more thing to do, a Sunday barbecue. He woke at 4 in the morning. The sky was still dark, stars burning their last shift before dawn. He walked to the barbecue pit behind the house, the pit his grandfather had built from creekstone in 1905, the pit his father had cooked on every Sunday, the pit where Tom had taught Billy to manage the fire and turn the meat and understand that barbecue was not cooking, but philosophy, patience, faith, the belief that time and smoke and low heat could transform the toughest, most resistant thing into something tender. He built the fire, mesquite wood from the creek bottom, split and dried in the barn since last winter. The wood caught slowly the way mesquite always does. Reluctant at first, then committed, burning down to coals that glowed like the heart of something ancient and patient. The smoke rose in the pre-dawn darkness, sweet and sharp, the smell that every Texan carries in their memory, regardless of where they go or how long they stay away. Tom unwrapped the brisket, 5 pounds of beef from his own stock butchered at the Johnson place last week. The meat was dark red, marbled with fat cold from the icebox. He mixed the rub in a bowl using the same recipe his grandfather had invented and his father had refined and he had memorized before he could read. Coarse sea salt, black pepper cracked by hand, paprika, dried garlic, and the secret, a touch of brown sugar, not enough to taste sweet, but enough to help the bark form during the long hours of smoking. His grandfather had added the brown sugar after a trip to East Texas where he tasted a black farmer's barbecue and came home saying, "That man knows something about meat that we don't, and I intend to learn it." The recipe had carried that act of respect in its ingredients for 3 generations. Tom rubbed the brisket with his hands. The salt and spice mixed with the fat and the cold meat and his skin and the act of touching food with his bare hands, of preparing nourishment through the oldest and most direct method, connected him to every Hargrove man who had stood at this pit and every Sunday that had passed in this yard and every meal that had been shared at the table under the pecan tree. He placed the brisket on the grate, closed the lid, and sat down beside the pit to wait. 12 hours. That was the commitment. 12 hours of tending the fire, adjusting the coals, monitoring the smoke, turning the meat only once at the 6-hour mark. 12 hours of sitting in the Texas heat with nothing to do but think and nothing to think about except everything. During those 12 hours, Tom made his invitations. Reverend Dawson, the Johnsons from the next ranch, Doc Carter and his wife, Rodriguez, the postman, and his family. He told each of them the same thing. Sunday barbecue, bring your people. There'll be 2 extra guests, Sachiko Tanaka and her daughter. They work on my ranch. The reactions varied. Dawson accepted with the solemn nod of a man who understood that this was not merely a social invitation, but a strategic operation. Johnson hesitated. His son was still overseas, still in the occupation forces in Japan, and the idea of eating brisket next to a Japanese woman created a dissonance he could not immediately resolve. But Johnson had eaten Tom's brisket for 30 years, and the pull of mesquite smoke on a Sunday afternoon was stronger than political discomfort. Carter said yes without hesitation. Rodriguez said yes in Spanish and English simultaneously. By 4 in the afternoon, the brisket had been in the smoke for 12 hours. Tom lifted the lid, and the smoke that escaped carried with it a smell so rich and so deep that it seemed to have physical weight, a smell that was salt and pepper and mesquite and rendered fat and 12 hours of patience made tangible. The bark on the outside of the brisket was dark as mahogany, cracked in places to reveal the pink smoke ring beneath. Tom pressed the meat with one finger. It yielded with the gentle resistance of something that had surrendered its toughness completely, that had been transformed by slow heat and time into the best version of itself. He carried the brisket to the carving board on the table under the pecan tree. The guests had gathered, lawn chairs and blankets spread across the yard. Martha had directed operations from her chair, her bandaged leg propped on a stool commanding the placement of side dishes with the authority of a general managing a campaign. Beans in the iron pot, coleslaw in the blue bowl, cornbread cut into squares on the wooden board, pickles, sweet tea in mason jars, Coca-Cola bottles in a wash tub of ice. Tom carved the brisket. The knife slid through the meat with almost no resistance. Each slice fell away from the whole like a secret being told, the interior pink and moist, the fat rendered to silk, the juice pooling on the cutting board in a shimmering layer that caught the afternoon light. The smell expanded into the yard and the guests leaned forward, instinctively drawn by the oldest and most powerful of all human signals, the smell of meat cooked with care by someone who knows what they are doing. Sachiko and Yumi arrived in the military truck. Sachiko wore the cleanest white shirt she owned, pressed with the camp's communal iron that morning. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She carried herself with the same straight posture she always carried, but today there was something different in it, not relaxation exactly, but a slight softening at the edges. The posture of someone who is trying very hard to hope and is afraid of what hoping will cost if the hope turns out to be wrong. Yumi wore a dress, the only dress she owned, a hand-me-down from the Johnson girl that Martha had altered to fit. It was blue with small white flowers, and Yumi wore it with the grave pride of a 5-year-old who understands that today is important, even if she cannot articulate why. Dusty greeted them at the gate with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a twig who has no concept of social awkwardness, his tail beating the air, his tongue finding Yumi's face before she could defend herself. The child laughed. The laugh cut through the tension in the yard the way sunlight cuts through cloud, not eliminating it entirely, but making it possible to see past it. Tom carved a slice of brisket and placed it on a plate and handed it to Sachiko himself. Not through Martha, not through Ortiz, hand to hand. Their fingers did not touch, but the distance between them was measured in millimeters, and the significance was measured in something larger than distance. Sachiko looked at the brisket. She lifted the slice. She took a bite, and her face changed. The composure that she wore like armor softened. Her eyes closed. She chewed slowly, and the taste moved through her in visible waves, the salt and the smoke, and the pepper and the rendered fat, and 12 hours of patience, and 3 generations of knowledge, all of it arriving on her tongue at once in a single overwhelming argument for the possibility that the world still contained pleasure. She opened her eyes. She smiled. It was the first time Sachiko Tanaka had smiled on the Hargrove property. The first time she had allowed her face to express something other than composure or concern, or the carefully neutral expression of a woman who has learned that showing emotion in enemy territory is showing weakness. Tom saw the smile and his breath caught because he recognized it. Not the specific smile, the category of smile, the involuntary, defenseless smile of someone who has just tasted something so good that for 3 seconds the world disappears and there is nothing but flavor in the body's ancient, grateful recognition of nourishment. Billy had smiled the same smile. Every person who had ever eaten Hargrove brisket had smiled the same smile. It was the universal smile of being fed, truly fed, and the fact that it looked the same on a Japanese face as it did on a Texas face was perhaps the simplest and most devastating proof that the categories Tom had lived by were meaningless. Yumi received her first Coca-Cola. She held the bottle with both hands, peered into the dark liquid with suspicion, then took a sip. The carbonation exploded on her tongue. Her eyes went wide. She sneezed. Then she giggled, a cascade of sounds so pure and delighted that the entire gathering laughed, even Johnson, even the Johnson boy's wife, who had been sitting with her arms crossed and her lips tight since she arrived. Reverend Dawson stood. The yard quieted. The old pastor had the kind of voice that did not need volume to command attention. It was a voice that had delivered sermons and eulogies and wedding benedictions for 3 decades, a voice that understood the weight of words and chose them with corresponding care. He did not mention Sachiko. He did not mention Kenji. He told a story, the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Japanese-American boys who volunteered to fight for America while their families sat behind barbed wire. Boys who were sent to Europe because the Army did not trust them enough to send them to the Pacific where they might face their ancestral countrymen. Boys who fought with a ferocity that stunned their commanders and earned them more decorations per capita than any unit in the history of the United States military. He told them about the Lost Battalion, the Texas boys trapped in the Vosges, the 442nd ordered to break through, 5 days of combat, 800 casualties to rescue 211 men, Japanese-American soldiers dying to save Texas soldiers, while back home the families of those Japanese-American soldiers were eating institutional food behind chain-link fences in places like Crystal City. Dawson told the story simply, without embellishment, without moral commentary. He let the facts do the work that facts do when they are true and terrible, and impossible to reconcile with the stories we tell ourselves about who the good people are and who the bad people are. When he finished, the yard was silent. Tom sat with his plate of brisket on his knee and tears running down his face. Not sobbing, just tears steady and quiet falling into his brisket. He did not wipe them away. He did not hide. For the first time in his life, Tom Hargrove cried in front of other people and did not feel that it diminished him. Because this was not weakness. This was the cost of understanding. This was what it felt like when the last wall came down and the truth walked in and sat at the table and helped itself to brisket, and you realized that you had been building walls against the wrong thing your entire life. We are almost at the end of this story, but before we reach it, I want to ask you something. If you have made it this far, if you have walked with Tom and Sachiko through this long Texas summer, then you already know that this is not just entertainment. This is remembrance, and remembrance needs a community. Subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me what this story means to you, because the stories we choose to remember are the stories that shape who we become. 2 days after the barbecue, Tom drove to Crystal City. He wore his good shirt, his polished boots, his best Stetson. He carried a folder that Martha and Reverend Dawson had helped him assemble with the meticulous attention to detail that marks the difference between a gesture and a strategy. Jennings was behind his desk. The office was small, military, organized with the precision of a man who believed that order was the antidote to chaos. Tom sat across from him and placed the folder on the desk. Inside the folder, Kenji Tanaka's military service records confirming his service in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. His official death notification from the Vosges campaign. Yumi Tanaka's birth certificate establishing her American citizenship. A letter from the military doctor at Crystal City confirming Sachiko's medical skills and her role in saving Martha Hargrove's life. Letters of sponsorship signed by Tom Hargrove, Reverend Robert Dawson, and Dr. James Carter. 3 citizens of standing guaranteeing that Sachiko and Yumi Tanaka would be provided for and would not become a burden on the public. Tom did not raise his voice. He spoke the way he spoke to cattle when they needed to be moved through a gate firmly, steadily, with the calm authority of someone who has decided the direction and will not be turned. Sergeant Jennings, Sachiko Tanaka is the widow of an American soldier who was killed in action. Her husband died saving Texas boys in France. Her daughter is an American citizen, born in Sacramento. Sachiko saved my wife's life when a rattlesnake bit her, and she would have lost her leg or worse without proper treatment. I am here to tell you that this woman belongs here. She and her daughter belong here. And sending them to a country that has been bombed to rubble, a country where she has no family, left a country where a 5-year-old American child will starve, is not justice. It is not the law operating as it should. It is cruelty wearing a uniform. Jennings looked at the folder. He opened it. He read each document with the careful attention of a man who has spent years making decisions based on paperwork and understands that the right piece of paper can change a life or end one. Mr. Hargrove, the law does not make exceptions based on sentiment. I'm not here with sentiment. I'm here with documents, service records, a death certificate, a birth certificate, medical testimony, community sponsorship. I am here with the law, Sergeant, your law, the same system you say you serve. I am asking that system to look at the evidence and make the right call. Jennings set down the service records. He looked at the photograph of Kenji in the 442nd uniform. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his wallet and pulled out the photograph of Danny. He placed it on the desk beside the photograph of Kenji. 2 soldiers, 2 dead men, 1 Japanese American who died saving Texas soldiers in France, 1 American who died in a Japanese prison camp in the Philippines. 2 photographs worn soft at the edges from years of being carried close to the body, 2 portraits of grief made portable, 2 faces of the same war staring up from the same desk. My brother weighed 84 pounds when he died, Jennings said. His voice was different now. The mechanical quality was gone. What remained was raw, unfinished, the voice of a man speaking from a place he had kept locked for years. The Japanese starved him, beat him, left him in a cage. I see that photograph every night. I have seen it every night for 3 years. And every morning I wake up and I do my job, because if I stop doing my job, then Danny died for nothing. If I let them go, if I show mercy, if I treat them as anything other than what they are, then what happened to Danny doesn't matter. It becomes random suffering instead of something that has consequences. Tom listened. He did not interrupt. He understood that Jennings was not making an argument. He was making a confession. But Jennings touched the photograph of Kenji. 442nd. I know what they did. Danny knew too. Danny wrote to me before Baton, before the march, before everything. Danny told me about the Nisei translators in his unit. He called them the best friends he had. Jennings closed his eyes, opened them. My brother respected them. The same people whose nation killed him. He respected them because they showed up. They did the work. They didn't have to be there, and they were there anyway. Silence in the small office. The clock on the wall. The distant sound of children playing somewhere in the camp. The weight of two dead soldiers pressing down on the desk between two living men. Tom spoke quietly. Danny died because the Japanese treated prisoners with cruelty. You want America to be like them, or do you want America to be better? Jennings looked at Tom for a long time. Then he looked at the two photographs side by side. Danny, Kenji, both dead. Both someone's brother, someone's husband, someone's son. Both gone into the ground on the opposite sides of the world, leaving behind people who looked at their photographs every night and tried to make the loss mean something. I will review the file, Jennings said. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not promising anything, but I will review it. He did not sign anything. He did not retract his recommendation. But he picked up his pen and wrote a note in the margin of Sachiko's file. Tom could not read it from across the desk, but he saw Jennings write the words pending review and the date, and he knew that in the language of bureaucracy, pending review was a door held open. Not an answer. A chance. Tom stood. He reached the door, turned back. Sergeant, you keep Danny's picture in your wallet. Sachiko keeps Kenji's picture in her shoe. You both lost someone. The difference between you is that you have the power to destroy her life with a signature, and she has no power at all. That's not justice. That's just geography. He left. Jennings sat alone with two photographs on his desk and a pen in his hand, in the terrible clarifying silence that comes when a man who has organized his entire life around certainty suddenly finds that the certainty has a crack in it. 3 weeks later, the decision came. Not with ceremony, not with a phone call or a visit. A letter. Official stationery. Addressed to Sachiko Tanaka, Crystal City Internment Camp. The letter stated that her repatriation had been reclassified from scheduled to deferred pending further review of case circumstances. It cited the military service of her deceased husband. It cited the American citizenship of her daughter. It cited the community sponsorship. Deferred was not freedom. Deferred was bureaucratic limbo, a gray space between categories where files went to be forgotten. But in the gray space was time, and time in the machinery of government had a way of turning temporary into permanent. Crystal City would close in 1948. The repatriation programs would wind down. The files marked deferred would gather dust on shelves in government warehouses until the warehouses themselves were decommissioned and the files were boxed and archived and eventually forgotten entirely. Sachiko would not be sent to Japan. Yumi would not lose her mother. The system had not been defeated. It had been redirected, nudged by a folder full of documents and the quiet, stubborn insistence of a Texas rancher who had learned from his dead son that faces mean nothing and actions mean everything. Martha delivered the news to Sachiko at Crystal City. Sachiko listened. Her face maintained its composure, but her hand found Yumi's hand and squeezed so tightly that the child yelped. Sachiko released her grip and looked at Martha and said 2 words. Thank you. The words carried the weight of every unspoken thing between them, every kitchen conversation, every flower-dusted afternoon, every silent moment of recognition between 2 women who understood that the world was harder than it should be and softer than it appeared. Martha shook her head. Thank your husband. If Kenji hadn't worn that uniform, we wouldn't have had anything to fight with. The last day came in late October. The labor program ended. Sachiko and Yumi came to the ranch one final time to collect the few personal items Sachiko had left in the barn, a pair of work gloves, a headscarf. Nothing of material value, but things she wanted back because they carried the smell of hay and mesquite smoke and the Texas dust that had become, against all expectation, the smell of the closest thing to safety she had known since Kenji died. Tom stood on the porch. Sachiko stood in the yard, 5 meters between them. Dusty lay on the steps, equidistant, his loyalty diplomatically distributed. They looked at each other. 3 months of shared labor and shared meals and shared silence, and the slow, painful dismantling of every assumption each had carried about the other. 3 months compressed into this moment, this 5 meters of Texas dirt this October afternoon, with the light going golden and the shadows reaching long across the yard. Sachiko bowed, not the quick perfunctory bow of daily greeting, a deep bow. The kind reserved for the deepest respect, the kind that in Japanese culture signifies a debt that cannot be repaid and an honor that cannot be adequately expressed. She held the bow for 3 full seconds, her back straight, even in its bend, her eyes on the ground. Tom nodded. One nod, short, the Texas equivalent, a gesture that contained everything his mouth could not form into words. Gratitude, respect, regret, the admission that he had been wrong, and the recognition that being wrong had saved him. Then Yumi ran up the porch steps and wrapped her small arms around Tom's legs. "Bye-bye, Mr. Tom." Her voice was bright and clear and carried none of the weight that the adults had been shouldering for months. She was 5. She understood nothing of the politics and the paperwork and the hatred and the healing. She understood that this man had a nice dog and cooked good bacon and let her draw on his porch with chalk and never once told her she did not belong. Tom looked down at the child, and he did something he had not done with any living person since Billy left for the war. He crouched down, brought himself to her eye level, and spoke directly to her with the same attention he would give to any person whose presence mattered. "Goodbye, Pequeña." The word Ortiz used. It came out of Tom's mouth wrapped in a Texas accent, and it sounded like a prayer. Yumi smiled. She turned and ran back to her mother. Tom straightened up, went inside, did not look back. Martha understood why. Looking back would mean breaking in front of them, would be a burden he did not want to place on shoulders that were already carrying more than any person should. Martha stayed on the porch. She handed Sachiko a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a jar of strawberry preserves, a bag of biscuit flour, and a handwritten recipe for chicken and dumplings in Martha's careful, slanted script. "So, you remember," Martha said. Sachiko took the package. She looked at Martha, and then she did something she had never done before in all her time at the ranch. She stepped forward and embraced Martha Hargrove. The hug was brief, fierce. 2 women holding on to each other in a yard in Texas, one with a bandaged leg, and the other with a broken country, both of them carrying griefs that would never fully heal, but had found in each other's company a way to be carried. They separated. Sachiko and Yumi climbed into the military truck. The engine started. The truck pulled away. Dusty chased it to the end of the drive, then stopped, sat in the dust, and watched until the vehicle disappeared behind the mesquite trees. Tom sat at the kitchen table. 4 chairs, 2 empty, Billy's, and now Sachiko's. He looked at the empty chairs for a long time. Then he poured coffee. Black, strong. He did not reach for the whiskey. On the table propped against the salt shaker were 2 items. The photograph of Kenji in his 442nd uniform. Billy's letter. Tom had taken them from the locked drawer and placed them here in the open in the light, where they could be seen every morning over coffee and every evening over supper. No more locked drawers, no more hidden truths. The desk was open, and the letter was read, and the photograph was displayed, and the wall was down, and Tom Hargrove was sitting in the rubble of everything he used to believe, drinking coffee and beginning. Months later in Crystal City, Sachiko cooked chicken and dumplings for the women in her section of the camp. Martha's recipe: American flour, American butter, American chicken prepared by Japanese hands using a Texas technique taught in a farmhouse kitchen during a war that was supposed to make them enemies. Mrs. Kimura sat at the communal table. She was 52, a former school teacher in the camp, who had spent years instructing children that the emperor was divine and America was the enemy. Since the surrender, she had become the angriest woman in Block 7, a woman whose understanding of reality had collapsed and who expressed her confusion through suspicion of anyone who seemed to be adapting too easily to the new world. She looked at the bowl of chicken and dumplings that Sachiko placed before her. She tasted the dumplings, chewed slowly. Her face was unreadable. Then she said, "This is not Japanese food. Sachiko served another bowl. No, it is Texas food. Mrs. Kimura ate in silence. She finished the bowl. She did not ask for seconds, but she did not leave the table. And in her staying and her willingness to sit with this foreign food and this complicated woman in this world that no longer made sense, there was a kind of surrender that had nothing to do with nations and everything to do with the small daily courage of allowing yourself to be fed by someone you were taught to distrust. 60 years later, 2005, San Antonio, Texas. The auditorium at Trinity University is filled for the Veterans Day Memorial. Flags line the stage. The audience is silver-haired and proud men in caps embroidered with the names of wars they survived and the units they served in, women and their Sunday-best grandchildren squirming in seats too large for them. In the front row sits a woman of 65. Her hair is silver-streaked with black. Her posture is straight. She wears a dark blazer and a small pin on her lapel, a golden torch, the symbol of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Her name is Dr. Yumi Tanaka Harrison, professor of history at the University of Texas at San Antonio, author of 3 books, wife of Patrick Harrison, a Texas attorney with Irish roots and a deep appreciation for his wife's barbecue. Mother of 2. Her son is named Thomas. Her daughter is named Martha. The names were chosen deliberately with the weight of history behind each one. Yumi published her memoir in 2003. One chapter is titled The Rancher, and she does not use Tom Hargrove's real name. But every detail is there. The bacon at dawn, the old dog on the porch, the empty chair at the table, the locked drawer, the brisket that smoked for 12 hours over mesquite coals while a man rebuilt his understanding of the world one piece of wood at a time. Tom Hargrove died in 1987. Quietly in his asleep in the farmhouse bedroom where he had slept for 60 years. Martha found him in the morning. He looked peaceful, she told the pastor at the funeral. He looked like he was saving a seat for someone. Martha followed in 1993. The ranch was sold to a family from Houston who raised horses instead of cattle, but kept the barbecue pit because some things belong to the land rather than to the people who passed through it. Sachiko lived until 2001. She spent her final years in San Antonio, near Yumi. She never remarried. She tended a small garden where she grew vegetables and chrysanthemums. White chrysanthemums, the color of mourning in Japan, the color of truth. She placed one on Kenji's grave every week, and one on a small stone marker she had placed in her garden that bore no name but represented everyone she had lost and everyone who had saved her. Yumi is introduced. She walks to the podium. She adjusts the microphone. She looks at the audience. In the front row beside her family sits a man of 70, thin, silver-haired, wearing a faded military jacket with service ribbons that speak of another war in another jungle. His name is William Dawson III. Bill, grandson of Reverend Robert Dawson, Vietnam veteran. He contacted Yumi after reading her book, recognizing the town, the church, the ranch, the story his grandfather had told him about a barbecue and a Japanese woman and a rancher who learned to see. Bill carries an envelope, old paper, yellowed. Inside is a letter written by a 21-year-old soldier in a foxhole in Okinawa in May of 1945. Martha Hargrove sent a copy to Reverend Dawson before she died. Dawson passed it to his son passed it to Bill. And now Bill places the envelope in Yumi's hands. Mrs. Hargrove said this belongs to the Tanaka family, Bill says. She said to give it to the girl who cried over the bacon. Yumi opens the envelope. She unfolds the letter. She has read the words before. Her mother shared the content years ago, but this is the original. Billy Hargrove's handwriting pressed hard into the paper, the letter slightly uneven, the ink faded but legible after 60 years. Don't hate anyone because of their face. I have seen faces that look like the enemy but belong to heroes. Yumi refolds the letter. She places it on the podium. She looks at the audience, and she tells the story. Not the political story, not the historical analysis she delivers in university lectures. The small story, the human story. A Texas rancher who cooked bacon every morning for a dead son's empty chair, and then one day found a living child sitting there instead. A Japanese widow who hid her husband's photograph inside her shoe because she was afraid that both sides would judge her for it. A 5-year-old girl who cried because bacon tasted like something she had forgotten was possible. An old dog who barked once and saved a man from the darkest moment of his life. A brisket that smoked for 12 hours, while a community decided whether mercy was weakness or strength. The auditorium is silent when she finishes. Then Bill Dawson stands. Then the row behind him. Then the row behind that. The applause builds like weather, like something natural and inevitable, the sound of 200 people recognizing a truth that is too large for any single person to hold alone. After the ceremony, Yumi and Bill stand outside under a live oak tree. The November air is cool. Yumi reaches into her jacket and removes a small object. The photograph of Kenji Tanaka in his 442nd uniform. The original. The one Sachiko carried in her shoe. The one that fell onto Martha's kitchen floor and changed the course of two families. She places it on the bench beside Billy's letter. One photograph and one letter, two artifacts from opposite sides of the same war, resting side by side on a bench in San Antonio while the live oak drops its leaves around them in slow descending circles. And between the photograph and the letter, Yumi places a single white chrysanthemum. She grew it in her garden, the same garden where her mother grew them, the same color her mother placed on Kenji's grave every week for 40 years. My mother always said white chrysanthemums are the color of truth, Yumi says. Bill looks at the flower, at the letter, at the photograph, at the woman beside him whose entire existence is proof that mercy is not weakness, but the most durable form of strength, a strength that outlasts horrid and outlasts war, and outlasts even the people who practice it, carrying forward through generations like a recipe passed from hand to hand, each generation adding something of their own, but keeping the essential ingredients intact. This is the story the textbooks do not contain. It lives not in the strategies of generals, but in the kitchens, in the barns, in the barbecue pits, where ordinary people made extraordinary choices. A rancher who fed the enemy, a widow who saved the enemy's wife, a child who cried over bacon because her body remembered what her mind had forgotten, an old dog who barked once and pulled a man back from the edge. The flower rests between the letter and the photograph. The oak drops its leaves. And somewhere in the space between memory and forgetting, a rancher sets an extra plate at the table and a woman bows and a child reaches for bacon with both hands. The story that history did not record continues in the only place it was ever meant to live, in the telling, in the feeding, in the quiet, stubborn act of setting a place at the table for someone the world says does not belong there, and watching them sit down and watching them eat, and knowing in your bones that this is the most important thing you have ever done. That is enough. That has always been enough.